By 1965, the Beatles were still a very close unit, despite having worked together almost every day for the last 7 years. They still go on vacation with each other and spend time together at Christmas. John and Ringo live a stone's throw away from each other. George is a 10-minute drive, while Paul is living an hour away at Jane Asher's family attic. The songs from their previous album Help are broadcast constantly on the radio, and their latest single Yesterday is holding the #1 spot. But the group are now bored with regurgitating the same pop songs over and over. They've grown older and changed emotionally. Paul later stated, "You don't think 16-year-old thoughts at 20. By this point, the music press are giving them a hard time. They view their music as dated, not current with the times. Their contemporaries had already embraced the counterculture and began evolving their music. Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home had been released in March. It split the album into two distinctive halves, side 1 being electric, with side 2 being acoustic. The album contained themes of anti-authoritarianism as well as economic criticisms. Dylan had evolved his protest songs with the album's surreal complex lyrics. Songs like The Night Before and You're Gonna Lose That Girl no longer seem relevant. Bringing It All Back Home had started the ball rolling. The Animals soon released We've Gotta Get Out of This Place, the Stones released Satisfaction, the Beach Boys released California Girls. The Beatles were under great artistic and commercial pressure. EMI were insisting they record a new album to be released for the Christmas holidays. They have no material ready, so John and Paul are forced to come up with 12 songs in just over 2 weeks. John and George by this point have both taken acid, with Ringo trying it for the first time in August. With McCartney's reluctance to join them, it had drew a rift between the four. The album would see Paul release a series of scathing love songs about Jane Asher, which were in direct contrast to his typical style. For the first time, John would write about love as a concept or idea, something that would be repeated in his later work, and George's experimentation with the sitar would be the beginning of the group's evolution to psychedelic rock pioneers. This is the story of the Beatles' recording of Rubber Soul. Sessions begin in April with George Martin as producer and engineers Norman Smith, Ken Scott and Phil McDonald. Every session will take place in EMI's Studio 2. By this point, George Harrison had become fascinated with the sitar, so much so he stated at the time, "Sometimes I go to sleep and I imagine what it would be like inside Ravi's sitar." Paul was also fascinated with a new instrument. He'd been taking piano lessons from a teacher at the Guildford School of Music. Along with that, Paul had also begun studying German composers. John was occupying his time reading current news events. He bought all the daily newspapers in England and meticulously went through each page. When he was through, he sat in the back room of his Weybridge mansion watching endless news reports. The three subjects that captivated him most were the civil rights movement, America's ever-growing involvement in Vietnam, and the psychedelic movement sweeping the States. Ringo was spending his time doting on his family. He was perfectly content being a father and a husband. He recently bought a camera so he could document all the important events in his son's life. He has little interest or ambition for anything else. When Mal Evans sets up their gear in Studio 2, the engineers noticed many of their amps and stage equipment had taken a beating from their US tours. The amps are still fully functional, but they've been knocked about so much they now look quite shabby. Conscious of what their contemporaries were recording throughout the sessions, the group would ask George Martin what they could do that nobody else had. They leaned on George in that respect. None of them could read music, but George could translate their requests and provide them with what was needed. On the 12th of April, they begin recording one of John's songs titled Run For Your Life. The lyrics, "I'd rather see you dead little girl than to be with another man," had been taken from Elvis's 1957 song Let's Play House. The entire song had been built around that notion. John didn't much care for the song, but he felt it was good enough to be acceptable for the album. They ran through 5 takes that day. The 5th was used for the LP. It would be used to close the album. The deliberate simplicity of the song seemed to be a direct nod to how far they've evolved. The next song they begin work on that day was one of John's he'd began writing in February. They recorded a backing track for This Bird Has Flown, later retitled Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown. The title had come from the cheap pine walls in Jane Asher's family home, and John had written the song about her extramarital affair. George Martin later referred to it as a very bitter little story. While practicing, George Harrison decided to add the sitar to accompany the 2 guitars. It was mind-blowing for the group. It changed their musical direction and everyone's attitude. From that point on, anyone could walk in with anything as long as it could make a musical note. They did just 1 take of Norwegian Wood and then put it aside for later. The next day, they begin work on Paul's first song for the album. A Tripper was a drug song written mainly by John. It had been claimed that the riff that opens the track and is present throughout was an attempt by John to improve on Keith Richards' guitar on Satisfaction. They lay down the whole track in just 4 takes. They select take 3 for the master and add overdubs later. At this time, during the sessions, a group of female fans attempt to break into Studio 2. Mal Evans goes outside to try and get them to leave. He steps outside the soundproof door, which led to another door, and then outside. His persuasions have no effect. The girls are so crazed, they begin grabbing and fighting to get in. They literally tear the shirt off Mel's back, and he goes back inside, vowing that is the last time he will ever do that. Following this, they record George's first song for the album, If I Needed. John later stated the song was his first major piece of work. He originally wrote the song with memories of Liverpool as a child, naming Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. He later discarded them as ridiculous and rewrote the lyrics with Paul. Though he did keep the lyrics that referred to his friend Stuart Sutcliffe. They read, "Some are dead and some are living. In my life, I've loved them all." The song was complete in 3 takes, all except for the bridge. They left that for now to decide upon later. The mindset while they were recording the album was also to give the fans value for their money. Paul later stated, "We wanted to do what we would have liked when we were record buyers ourselves." 2 days later, they began work on the B-side to Day Tripper. We Can Work It Out was written primarily by Paul. His turbulent relationship with Jane Asher was the inspiration. At this time, Paul wrote a trilogy of songs about her. They all stemmed from her reluctance to be the stay-at-home wife Paul wanted. In this song, he pushed the notion, if you see things my way, things will work out for the best. The backing track was complete in just 2 takes, but the vocals took the whole evening to perfect. It was George Harrison who came up with the idea to slow the verse down to a waltz. Just 2 takes were needed to record the backing track. The group would later disagree on whether Paul or John's song should be the A-side. It ended up being the first ever double A-side. In the end, Paul's song received more airplay. It was the beginning of Paul overtaking John as the dominant force in the group. On the 21st of October, the group began the remake of Norwegian Wood. 3 takes were recorded, each completely different to the last. Take 2 had a sitar intro and featured no drums or bass.
This bird has flown, take 2.
2, 3.
Take 4 is the version we now know. Norman Smith had trouble recording George's sitar. The instrument kept peaking and going into the red, creating a distorted sound. On the 22nd of October, John decided he wanted George Martin to play a solo for In My Life's unfinished bridge. Martin first played the organ, but it didn't sound right. He then switched to piano. The problem was, the piano tempo didn't sound quite right. George decided to play it at half speed and then speed it up afterwards. After that, they completed 4 takes of John's song Nowhere Man. John had written the self-biographical song in a frustrated writing session. McCartney interpreted the song as being a reflection of his marriage to Cynthia, the narrator of the story having no direction and no world view. Lennon wrote the song, as he often did, in the third person, but it ended up with the line, "Isn't he a bit like you and me?" On October 24th, the first attempt at Paul's song I'm Looking Through You begins. I'm Looking Through You was the second written about Paul's girlfriend Jane Asher. By this point, they'd began to have problems. An observer described them as being like 2 speeding trains going in opposite directions. Paul was becoming more agitated with her by the day. The noticeable difference in the first version are the use of maracas, hand claps, and a reggae sounding guitar. For whatever reason, the group weren't satisfied with it, and for now it was put aside. The Beatles at this point took a few days off recording. On the 29th, they appeared at Buckingham Palace to receive their MBEs from the Queen. It was the first time pop stars had received this accolade. Before heading to Buckingham Palace, the group congregated at Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall's flat. The flat had become somewhat of a storage unit for the Beatles. One of the cupboards was full of Beatles gold records. From the flat, they were driven by John's chauffeur to Buckingham Palace. At the same time the Beatles were taking a break, George Martin had been mixing the previous songs at EMI. Martin had spent almost every day there for the last 14 years. He'd been responsible for bringing the label into the rock and roll era, earned them tens of millions, and he was still picking up less than £70 a week. After they returned to the studio, John had an idea to record an old song they used to play. He asked Paul, "Do you remember that French thing we used to do at Michelle's parties? That's a good tune. You should do something like that." Paul at this time had been going over the title Michelle for a possible song, and he felt it would fit perfectly. He began working on the song, and with the help of a friend's wife who spoke French, filled in a few phrases. When Paul came back to John, the song was finished except for a middle 8. John came up with the idea of repeating, "I love you, I love you, I love you," and for the next verse, "I want you, I want you, I want you." The Beatles spend the 3rd of November working on Michelle. By now, time is of the essence. It's less than a month away that EMI would like to release the album. With several songs not even written yet, the sense of urgency prompts 2 things. 1. Sessions to go late into the night, and 2. Previously discarded songs to be considered. At this point, the group receive a supply of much needed new amps from Vox. The next day, they begin work on Ringo's song for the album. What Goes On was one of the previously discarded songs. It was a very old song. John had first written it back in 1959. Paul went about making up a multi-track home demo of the song so he could show Ringo what it sounded like. Predictably, the backing track was recorded in just 1 take, with overdubs added later that night. 2 days later, the group reattempt Paul's song I'm Looking Through You. With this remake, they got much closer to their intended sound, but it wasn't quite right yet, and for now, the song was put aside again. November 8th, the group begin work on George Harrison's second song for the album, Won't Be There With You, later retitled Think For Yourself. Time is now fast running out, and the group are required to record their yearly Christmas record for the Beatles fan club. At the end of the session, George Martin recorded them thanking their audience, singing Yesterday in a comical voice and talking in exaggerated Liverpool accents. 2 days later, they begin recording one of John's songs titled The Word. It was the first time the group had wrote about love as a concept, a solution, a plan with intention. It was inspired from John's childhood understanding of the word love. He believed it was an essential part of many writings. This inspired the line, "In the good and the bad books that I have read." The song was perfected in just 3 takes. By now, they'd been given their deadline. The album had to be finished immediately, but they were still 3 songs short. John and Paul each came up with one in quick succession. John's song was titled Girl. The song was again proof of John's talent when under pressure. John had took inspiration from Paul's song Michelle. Girl was the most melancholy of the album and the most complex love song to be written to date. John and George were both recorded strumming acoustic guitars with capos. Doing so gave an extra brightness to the song. Harrison had his capos so high up the neck it created a sitar-like quality. John wanted the song to sound very intimate. To achieve this, George Martin put a special compressor on their voices. John even asked his breath be audible when he breathed. The background la-las by George and Paul were inspired by the Beach Boys and their innocence while singing. Paul's song brought forward in quick succession was You Won't See Me. This was the final song in the Jane Asher trilogy, documenting Paul's seemingly doomed relationship. Reportedly, Paul was unhappy Jane wasn't spending more time at home and putting her relationship before her career. She'd recently turned 20 and accepted an offer to act in a stage production. This caused an argument between the couple and they briefly split. While working at the theatre, Paul rang her, to which she ignored his calls. This caused Paul a lot of pain and it was documented in the song. With the album now 1 song short, they revisit an early song recorded but rejected for the Help album. McCartney's song Wait had been written in the Bahamas and recorded back in June. With the song complete, the album is finished and mixed. Rubber Soul was for the Beatles the end of an era. They would never again release 2 albums of new material a year. They would never again work with engineer Norman Smith. Smith had worked with the group their whole career. In his place, Geoff Emerick would now have the task of implementing sonic effects to fit the imagery the group would conjure up. On release, Rubber Soul was met with confusion by fans. The transformation was a lot to stomach, but to their musical peers, it was revolutionary. They embraced the concept of albums not consisting of singles or weaker material being used as filler. Rubber Soul had contained a consistency of high quality compositions. In other words, it changed the way musicians wrote and recorded songs. Critically, they were praised. The music press who'd come down on them for writing generic pop songs reversed their views and now stated the album was as brilliantly original as anything written today. The whole album was an answer to whether the Beatles could evolve past their pop image. There was now a maturity to their songs. McCartney's somber jazz chords used in Michelle, Lennon's ode to his childhood from In My Life, Harrison's use of unconventional instruments. The distorted cover photo saw the Beatles of old stretched as if transitioning into different people. The group now didn't have to write easily digestible songs to appease teenage girls. They didn't want to either. Ultimately, the album was a goodbye to commercialism and any expectation of what or who the Beatles are. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.